Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor for me to join in this debate on the extension of our essential military and humanitarian mission in support of innocent people, innocent victims of Syria and Iraq, victims of this terrorist organist ISIL, Daesh, as it is called.
Let me be clear. Canada has always had a sense of moral obligation to act in concert with our allies when faced with grave threats to our security and global security. And we also believe in a moral obligation to, wherever possible and prudent, to defend the innocent from the deprivations of genocide and ethnic cleansing, as is the case today in Iraq and eastern Syria. So, Mr. Speaker, let us understand, first of all, the nature of the enemy, I would say the common enemy of humankind in the so-called Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIS or Daesh. Mr. Speaker, this is an organization, it's hard for some, perhaps with the Enlightenment Western paradigm, to grasp the nature of this organization, because it is profoundly irrational in everything, in its entire ideology, in its motivations and in its actions. This is an organization which is motivated by a dystopian vision of imposing through violence a caliphate, which is the idea of a theocracy grounded in a particularly violent iteration of 7th century Sharia law. And, Mr. Speaker, this organization and its fellow travelers regard anyone who does not share their dystopian vision of a caliphate as a kafir, as an infidel, as an enemy, as someone who is marked for, at best, slavery, dimitude, or at worst, death, and often a particularly gruesome one. This is an organization which, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and various independent human rights observers, is responsible for some unthinkable depravities, for beheading children, for mass sexual slavery of girls as young as 8, of targeting gay men by in one instance that is recorded on film by them, throwing a gay man off a tower, and when he didn't die, stoning him to death. An organization that has sought to erase from the face of the earth the small and vulnerable minority community of the Yazidis, an ancient religious and ethnic community. ISIS has sought to obliterate the ancient Assyrian Chaldean peoples of the Ninevan plains, who are the indigenous people of that region of Mesopotamia, who have been there, whose ancestors have been there for thousands of years, who for the better part of 1,700 years have observed the Christian faith, but for even longer have spoken their own ancient tongue, Chaldean and Aramaic. Mr. Speaker, ISIS is an organization that has quite literally no regard for the sanctity of human life, that regards girls and women as property rather than people, that regards minorities not as people worthy of protection and respect, but rather obliteration and elimination. Let me just share with you one specific example that was of its barbarity that was related to me by Archbishop Louis Sacco, the leader of the Chaldean Iraqi church. He told me that after ISIL invaded Mosul, the second largest city of Iraq, and issued a fatwa of death or conversion or dimitude for the Christians of Mosul, that they fled with their possessions, which were all taken by ISIL, but that a handful of infirm, handicapped, elderly Christians were left behind in hospitals. They couldn't move, they didn't have relatives. And that Daesh, ISIL, went into these hospitals And after the allotted 48 hours had passed for the fatwa, they approached these infirm, handicapped, elderly Christians in their hospital beds and told them that if they did not convert on the spot, that they would be killed, that they would be beheaded in their hospital beds. So let there be no doubt, Mr. Speaker, about the kind of barbarism, the kind of, quite frankly, evil with which we are dealing. Now, Mr. Speaker, in light of this, I believe it is incumbent upon us to act for humanitarian reasons. I believe doing so is consistent with the principle of the responsibility to protect. Now, admittedly, the actual incarnation of that doctrine at the United Nations requires the approval of Vladimir Putin and the Chinese Politburo. But, Mr. Speaker, we ought not to encumber Canadian policy with the approval of Vladimir Putin. We should be able to act independently to prevent genocide, to prevent yet more victims from being claimed. Mr. Speaker, we also have a national security imperative to do so because, as you will know, ISIS has explicitly declared war on Canada, has called on its supporters to kill Canadians wherever they find them, and it is rather evident that the two terror attacks on Canadian soil that took Patrice Vincent and Nathan Cirillo in October of last year were at least inspired by the barbarism of ISIL. Mr. Speaker, had the world not begun to act, had the coalition of some 24 countries involved in the military combat against ISIL in Iraq and Syria not begun last September and October, had the other 40 allied countries supporting non-military action against ISIL not done so, had these things not occurred, it is clear that ISIL would have continued to gain more territory in Iraq, more resources, more oil fields, more wealth, more armaments, and, most worryingly, more legitimacy in the eyes of those who are susceptible to radicalization.
And that is a threat to Canada. We know that there are more than 100 Canadians in Syria and Iraq to join the terrorist organization, and when they return to Canada will pose a risk to Canadian security. And it's the same in all developed countries. So we must show people who are susceptible to radicalization, to be recruited by ISIL, that it doesn't represent this idea of a caliphate, that it's a far-fetched organization.
Has committed the Royal Canadian Air Force with 6 CF-18s, 1 Polaris aerial refueling aircraft, and 2 CP-140 modernized Aurora aircraft to join the Allied air combat mission against ISIL targets. And it's also why we've committed 69 Special Operations Forces to an advice, assistance, training mission with the Kurdish Peshmerga near Erbil in northern Iraq. I'm pleased to report, Mr. Speaker, that thanks in part to the brilliant work of our men and women in uniform and our allies, we have moved ISIS from being on the offensive, gaining new territory last summer and fall, to being on the defensive, losing territory now. Regrettably, well, I should say that we now note ISIL moving some of their heavy equipment that has not yet been struck by Allied aerial bombardments from Iraq back into Syria. And we hope that with the assistance of Allied air support, Iraqi security forces will, in due course, launch an effective ground combat counteroffensive in which we will not participate on the ground, Mr. Speaker, but which we will support from the air. All of this indicates that, in due course, the center of gravity of the fight against ISIL is likely to move westward into eastern Syria, which is the center of its operations. Its capital is located in Raqqa, in central east Syria. Mr. Speaker, this is an area that, for all intents and purposes, the brutal Syrian regime has ceded sovereignty over to ISIL. And we therefore believe, as pursuant to advice, legal advice received from our own Judge Advocate General and the position taken by President Obama's administration, that we have every legal prerogative to pursue the ISIL targets in eastern Syria, in part at the invitation of the government of Iraq under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter to give practical expression to the collective right of self-defense. Mr. Speaker, I believe that this modest expansion of the mission and this one-year horizon proposed in the motion provides precisely the kind of rules of engagement that our military need to continue to play a meaningful role in this international coalition. I'll simply close by saying that we ought not to expect others, like the Netherlands or Australia, France or Britain, or our Arab partners, to do all of the difficult heavy lifting, Mr. Speaker. This is a responsible democracy. This country is a champion of human dignity and freedom. And we must act now, as we always have through our history, to defend those values and indeed our own interests. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member, la députée de Chicoutimi.
The honourable member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question to the minister is a simple one. He must be aware that when we ask our Canadian forces to put their lives in danger by participating in missions abroad. Now, I will point out that I have an Air Force base in my riding, Bagotville, and I take this mission very seriously because I know the men and women who will be participating in these missions and putting their lives in danger. So I'd like to ask the Honourable Minister if the base in Bagotville will be called upon to contribute to this mission. I know that Cold Lake has been used. It was the Air Force base that provided the bulk of the forces for the first phase. The Honourable Minister of National Defence, I'd like to thank the member for his question, and to date I can point out that the fighter jets, the CF-18s in Kuwait for the military mission against ISIL have, for the most part, or have all in fact to come from Cold Lake.
I cannot say exactly which resources will be deployed. That's a question, obviously, for the commanders of our military forces. They will decide, according to their needs and their resources, which bases, which squadrons, which fighters will be used.
Question that I will leave, obviously, to our military commanders to decide in future rotations for the operations out of Kuwait, which squadrons will be called upon to contribute. But obviously, there are periodic rotations of equipment and personnel, and we'll notify the member and the House if there are changes in this respect.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Louis.
I was reading a little while ago that the Parliamentary Budget Officer claims that the budget cuts have harmed the Department of National Defence's, the military's capacity to undertake missions in the long term, and it looks like we're going to be in this conflict for quite a while, based on what the government's been saying. Now, apparently, Canada only spends about 1% of its GDP on the military, whereas Canada's allies, Britain and the U.S. notably, are asking that we spend 2% of GDP on the military. So I'm just wondering, is the government planning to accede to our allies' request that we spend 2% of GDP on the military?
The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I should point out that since this government came to office in 2006, we've increased the budget for the Department of National Defence from $14.3 billion in 2005 to $20.1 billion, which will be the full and final estimates for the current fiscal year, which represents a 27% increase, faster than the increase in inflation or the economy during that period, at a time during which most of our principal allies have actually been reducing their military budgets in absolute terms. Indeed, we increased the the automatic annual escalator for the DND budget, so it receives a 2% increase every year, effectively protecting the DND budget from inflation, something that no other department benefits from. It also has a special capital accrual budget for procurement of equipment, such as, by the way, next Monday I'll be receiving our 5th C-17 Globemaster strategic airlift airplane at CFB Trenton. So we made important investments, and most importantly, the men and women of the forces are able to do the job that we assigned to them. In many missions, Canada has been punching above its weight. We'll continue to give them the resources they need, and I can confirm to the House that the government will be allocating to the Department of National Defence incremental resources above its baseline budget to cover the costs, the incremental costs associated with Operation Impact in Iraq and Syria.
Reprise de débat.
Resuming debate.